Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Jenna Yarley. I'm the Realms Development Manager. I use she, her pronouns. I'm just going to go over a few logistics before I pass it off to our lovely panel. We are in webinar format, so we ask that you use the Q&A function rather, for any questions, and you can upvote. If you see a question that you'd also like answered that's already been asked, you can upvote that in the Q&A function. If you have any problems with any technical anything, feel free to chat me separately. The Realm seeks to be an equitable, inclusive, anti-oppressive, anti-racist organization. More information on our mission and our values is available on our website, theplaywrightsrealm.org, which I'm going to link in the chat now. Those values also extend to this virtual space. If at any time you feel you experience anything that is not in alignment with those values, please feel free to chat me directly now or email us after the fact. I will turn on captions. And if you need those, you can turn them on yourself. They're enabled. I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Lenape. I offer recognition and respect and acknowledge that colonialization is an ongoing process that continues to impact the lives and lands of Native communities. I want to acknowledge that in addition to the physical land we occupy today, the platforms, technology, and equipment that we are using consume resources that are based in physical lands and are not universally accessible to all peoples and communities. I'm sharing another link in the chat for those who would like to learn more about the spaces we occupy, and I invite you to take a moment to share where you're joining us in the chat. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Becca, our literary coordinator, who will moderate the panel.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Hi, everybody. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be with you all this evening. My name is Becca Weiss. As Jenna said, I am the literary coordinator at the Playwrights Realm. I am a dramaturg, a creative producer, and we are going to get into what all of that means in a deeper way with our wonderful, brilliant panel of dramaturgs. So at the Playwrights Realm, my work involves working with our writing fellows group. We have an alumni writers group, and for a dramaturg, particularly a dramaturg like myself who is very interested in new play dramaturgy, which we will definitely be discussing this evening. It's really a joy because the Playwrights Realm is, as is in the name, it is a playwright-centered organization. Supporting playwrights is the mission, as you all may know from being here tonight. And so I have the great honor of getting to work with a wonderful group of emerging writers and in a dramaturgical capacity, and working with them on developing plays throughout the course of the year on various programs. So we are going to get into all of that a little bit more. And right now I am going to ask our wonderful panelists to turn on their cameras, and I will bring them all in and introduce them. Wonderful. Hello, welcome everybody. So I'm going to ask you to go one by one. I'll call on you to introduce yourself. Let us know your pronouns, where you are zooming in from this evening. And then my first question, which will be part of the introduction here, is when people ask you what you do and you say you are a dramaturg and they say, huh, what's that? What do you tell them? What is your log line for this elusive job that we have? One of the most elusive, I would say, jobs in our industry. So that is how we will start it off, and I will let Phaedra start us. So please introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Phaedra Scott, she, hers. I'm coming from the land of the Munsee Lenape, also known as Nyack, New York, or colonially known as Nyack, New York. My log line for dramaturgy is I help in supporting artists tell the best story possible, the most efficient way possible.
Yes. Wonderful. Jack, would you go next?
I will. My name is Jack Phillips Moore. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am zooming to you live from the unceded land of the Lenape, also known as Brooklyn, New York. My log line for dramaturgy changes often, but I guess the shortest one I've come up with is I try to help create the space, circumstances, and resource that allow generative artists to do their best work possible. Best generative work possible. I added a word this time.
I love this too. And Sebastián, bring it on home.
Hi everyone, I'm Sebastián Alberdi, he, him, his. I'm zooming in from the traditional land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people, also known as Brookline, Massachusetts. And when I tell people what a dramaturg is, it's usually people who don't really watch theater at all. That I'm trying to explain like my life choices to people most of the time. So I tell them that I'm usually in the room because I do a lot of like institutional work, not with playwrights in the room. So I tell people that I help sort of the actors and directors have a better understanding of the text that they're working with, answer any questions about the world outside of the play that might inform the play. And yeah, that I'm really just there to provide information and help people get the play on its feet in a more informed way.
Love it. And yes, as I think we've all kind of touched on already in our introduction, it's a job that not many people have a clear idea of if they don't work in theater themselves, and probably one of the positions within the theater that might that people who aren't seeing it as much when they are younger might not have an understanding of how one gets into this field. So I think it would be really wonderful for everybody to give kind of an overview of how they first got into dramaturgy, your trajectory into this field, and sort of like how the arc of your career has landed to where you are today. So I'll let whoever wants to go first jump in and give us a little bit about that.
I'm happy to go first. So my journey was definitely like this. And so it's kind of hard to say when exactly I was like, I'm a dramaturg and I came into myself as a dramaturg. But I actually started off as a historian, actually. I wanted to be a museum, like basically a museum curator. And so a lot of my experience at the very beginning involved, you know, history, public history, making sure people found history fun and accessible. And the more museums I worked at, the more bored I got, mainly because I felt like the theater, the history people were a little bit more like reserved than what I wanted. And so then I learned about the world of dramaturgy, which married two things that I really loved, which is theater and history. At least that was like the very basic understanding that I had of it at the time when I was first learning about it. And it took me time and like experiences of working on projects that I was like, as like other roles as a stage manager or director, to realize dramaturgy really was where my heart lived. And so I really exclusively do only new play development. But a lot of it is really influenced by my museum background, as well as my background as a radio journalist for NPR in Boston when I used to live there.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Thanks.
And you're a playwright as well, right?
Yes.
You do all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah. I love stories.
Me too. I'm unmuted, so I'll go next. I also had no earthly idea what a dramaturg was for a very long time. I got into theater because of, I think, the way a lot of people do, which is like school plays. I was a very loud and obnoxious person and couldn't run fast, so that meant theater when I was in school. And that was really fun. And then decided that that is what I wanted to try to do for a living, which was hilarious. So I actually did try to do that for quite a while until I was like 25. And then I kind of was like, I don't know if this is in the cards for me. And I was living in New York and at the time, and I still do. But I was just looking for a job. I just needed something to help me pay bills and have health insurance while I was trying to figure out what to do instead of acting. And on a whim, a friend of mine who had interned there told me that they were looking for an entry-level, to fill an entry-level position at the public theater, which I'd gone to NYU for undergrad, so I knew the public, mostly because I used to sneak into opening night parties there. Because I couldn't afford to play there. And I wound up getting that job, which was very unexpected. And I was like, okay, I will do whatever it is they want me to do here, and then I will quit after like a year, and then I'll go do something else. And it's been 9 years, so I didn't get around to leaving. And the way I found dramaturgy there was honestly, my first job was I was essentially like a gopher for both our artistic director Oscar Eustace and our executive director Patrick Willingham, like getting coffee and filing papers and stuff. And after about a year of that, I was like, what was really cool about that was I was sort of in the crow's nest of the ship. And so I was able to kind of like see for the first time, like all these other people who make theater, but aren't like actors or directors or writers. And like, I don't know about y'all, but like, I didn't know that that was a thing. I was like, oh, these people over here raise money and they're marketers. And like, these people are really good painters. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And then sure enough, you look long enough and there was a couple weirdos in the corner who read plays for a living. And I was like, I want to try to do that. And one day I just asked the literary manager at the time, can I read plays for you? And she like breathed a sigh of relief and put a giant pile on my desk. And then that was it. And then so I've been, and that was 6 years ago. So I've been doing it ever since. And I don't know, it attracted me. I like also, you know, reading stories and talking about stories. So it just sort of followed my nose to that corner of the building. And I was very fortunate that there was a need there and I was able to make a little home there, so.
Yeah, I have a sort of similar story and oh, sorry. I have a sort of similar story in that it was a job I sort of applied to on a whim. So during college, I was an English major. I thought that I wanted to go into publishing. Like I did a bunch of internships and like volunteer like slush pile reading for like either literary magazines or like small little publishing houses that like specified in like novellas or something. So I sort of had that literary experience on that side, but it wasn't until I was sort of just in one of my friend's dorm rooms, and she was a theater major, and she was asking me like what I was going to do after college, and I was like, honestly, I don't know. Like I love theater. Obviously, I was also acting at the time. I never really wanted to be an actor, but I enjoyed doing it in college. I felt like it was the last time to be able to do it. And I was like, I love the theater, but I feel like I have to do like what my skills, you know, what I've been doing for the past 4 years. And she was like, well, have you ever heard about like literary departments in theaters? And I was like, no, like what is a literary department? I really thought it was like directors and actors and like, that's it. And she was like, well, you know, it's people who like read scripts and like, figure out like what the season is going to be, like work with writers, etc. And I was like, oh, that sounds amazing. So I sort of started looking up potential opportunities post-grad, and I stumbled upon the Huntington's like apprenticeship program because I'm living in Boston. And I sort of applied on a whim. I was like, there's no way I'm going to get this. I have no experience. Like all my experience is in this completely different field, which like is not that different when you think about it. But I ended up getting it. And that's really like where I learned about dramaturgy. It was sort of this like dropped into the deep end, was doing dramaturgy from, you know, the first month that I was there. And I was there for the past 3 years. I ended up becoming the literary associate after a year as an apprentice. And yeah, so that was sort of my sort of random, but really wonderful sort of introduction to dramaturgy. I sort of fell into it.
I love it. I love it. I want to touch on something that Phaedra brought up, which is the entry point being research, because I think there is both an idea that is certainly accurate in some cases totally not accurate, about dramaturgs as researchers. You know, I've worked in a regional theater where I've done sort of like traditional dramaturgy, where I'm like researching Scandinavian marriage laws for a production of A Doll's House, which is very different than what we are doing often as new play dramaturgs. So I would love to hear from all of you kind of about how those two parts of dramaturgy interact with each other, how much of them play into your day-to-day as a dramaturg. I know we've touched on the fact that many of us here really, the new play dramaturgy is where our focus lies. And yeah, how do you make sense of those kind of two aspects of it?
So I really exclusively only work on new plays, I would say. I think I worked on one like established play in my whole life, and everything else has been new. And with that, it's typically the writer is in the room. And what I learned from experience was like, you can have all the research in the world, but it doesn't mean anyone's going to read it. And so what I learned, I think not really the hard way, but in a way that I thought was great, was how can I make this actually fun and accessible, that people want to engage with this and that people want to spend time with this, which has sort of changed my dramaturgical practice in general. Like I really focus on media and I really focus on images. And when it comes down to like the very specifics of like the nitty gritty of like, there are sometimes you do need to research Scandinavian marriage laws, that I try to make it super easy, like literally like not like a less than a paragraph of like a information, so that way people can look at these like one sheets of things. But what I think is really important, like an important distinction, is that, you know, dramaturgs are not just glorified Googlers, and that we bring much more to the table than just research. What we are able to do is synthesize information in a way that makes it relevant to the play, relevant to the world that we're living in, and making sure that at least we have all the facts. So that way, when a writer is working on the story, they know like, okay, this is accurate, but if I depart from this, then I'm choosing to do that. So it's really like giving the tools to succeed, as opposed to like, here's all this information that you need to memorize.
Totally. Anyone else have thoughts on that? If you're saying cool fonts are not enough to get them to
Yeah, no, not for me.
your dramaturgy packet.
Fonts are awesome.
Yeah.
Similar to Phaedra, I work primarily in a new play theater, so that's the majority of my practice. But there have been times, again, you know, as Phaedra said, based on the project and the writer and director, sometimes I will do quite a bit of research, not because it feels like, oh, I have to make a packet, because that's what we do here at the public theater, because we don't. I find it often happens when there are writers who that is part of their process of how they build a story, how they first write a story and then rewrite a story. So like some writers, you know, it's just about conversations with that writer that help shape the trajectory of the piece. But there's some people like someone I work with a lot is a fantastic playwright named Dickerson, Dispenza. And when I first started working with her, if you don't know Erica is the top 5 smartest people you've ever met. And I remember, and early on, I very much wanted to impress her because she was a genius and I wasn't. And geniuses are fun to have as friends. And so, and she is absolutely meticulous in telling a story about knowing everything that underlies the world that she's describing. So in the case of the first play, which is a play called Colored Water, it takes place during the height of the Flint, Michigan water crisis. And so in order to even have a conversation with her about scene structure, I had to know as much as she did about this world. And so that was a huge part of just being able to have the confidence to walk into that room with her, was to be like, all right, I know what this world is. I've read the same things you have. Now let's have a conversation that we have the same set of facts between us. You know, but also that's just, again, that's a huge part of just how she works. So I always will accommodate the way a playwright works and prioritize what they prioritize.
Yeah, I want to just say that like I definitely agree with Phaedra in that the media and stuff is like always super interesting to me as a dramaturg, and for the most part the rooms that I work in, I try to find like poetry. I come from an English background, so I try to find like poems that might be helpful to like either get in the world of the play or sort of understand stuff that's happening in the play. And the other thing I'll say is that I sort of going off of this idea of having to have all the knowledge about something before walking in. Like one of the plays that I worked on that was sort of a new development play was Quixote Nuevo with Octavio Solis. And with that play, it was really interesting because it was a play that felt very close to my background as like a Mexican-American person working, in the theater and stuff. So I think I think it's a really interesting role that the dramaturg brings, because like depending on who the dramaturg is, I feel like some dramaturgs feel the need to say that like, oh, I don't matter, like I'm just here to like serve this role, which I think is really kind of self-defeating and like does the dramaturgical field a disservice. Like we are artists as well, and like our thoughts and our experiences will affect, you know, like how we have conversations with playwrights, how we help them tell their story, how we have conversations with directors, you know, because like dramaturgs have to work with directors a lot. Like if the director likes dramaturgs, you're going to have a good time, and if the director doesn't really like dramaturgs, it's going to be a little bit harder. So yeah, I don't know. I think I forgot the question. I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking about like how personal identities and experiences also do find their way into the room through the dramaturg in a way that can be really helpful to pieces.
I mean, I think it speaks to really the collaborative nature of this position, that you are obviously like playwright focused, but directors, designers, like there are many other people who share in the kind of dramaturgical process. And that's a great segue for us to talk a little bit more about the nitty gritty of process. I would say that as we're all like great lovers, supporters, cheerleaders of writers, there is, I think, a like a dedication to adjusting your practice to the writer that you're working with, of course. But I also wonder about if you've developed techniques that you bring into a process of working with a writer, things that, you know, are particular to your style, or if you, you know, are always shifting based on what the writer's needs are and how those two things interplay in your practice. Was a head scratcher on that one.
I think like the really short, easy answer is adjusting to what the writer needs or artist needs. And so I think there are inherently, as a dramaturg, you're kind of a chameleon, and you're inherently really flexible, because like that's, you know, where the artistry lies, I think, is in the ability to like shift really quickly and to go along with the ride, and to like, you know, you're going with the river that is the play, as opposed to, you know, trying to fight against it. And I don't know if there's like specific like tools that I use, but I do make a point to meet the writer and not even talk about the play before we start working on the play. I think that's really important. And then also asking, how do you want to work, to the writer? Because, you know, it's like we can't read people's minds, and what works for someone else doesn't work for everybody, or, you know, all that stuff. So a lot of it is the customization, but then also the ability to figure out how I need to work in order to do the best job possible for myself too. Because like sometimes that means like sitting down and like reshifting my thinking. Recently, I've been working on a lot of ballets and puppet theater recently, and like it's been cool, but also there's no text. And so I've always worked on text, and I was like, how can I work on something that has no text? And then just realizing like, that's okay. Like, I'm just going to figure it out. And it's been like a really fun collaboration, knowing that I'm coming to this as a learner, which is what the choreographer ultimately wanted. So I think it's totally a balance.
Yeah, I completely agree with the idea of having to shift from room to room. I think something that I always try to be good about, and sometimes I've been more successful, other times I haven't, is really letting the writer know that like I'm there for them in terms of like resources or information that they might need. Like I've worked with playwrights who are kind of shy about asking for help, and I think something that is a skill that dramaturgs need to have, is to make yourself available in a way that seems approachable and is like, oh, this is someone that like actually really cares about my piece and like wants to make it the best piece that it is. And you know, they're here doing their job, and like the way that they do their job is by me asking them to do their job. So finding that relationship between you know, and like you said, Rebecca, like anyone in the room, like it can be a designer, it can be a director. Like I really do try to make myself available to people if they have questions. Because, you know, everyone needs, like a lot of designers do their own dramaturgy, but like it's always helpful for a dramaturg to help out if that's needed as well, you know? So, yeah.
I mean, same in everything that's been said, but I guess to get into nitty gritty for me, I mean, like with any other theatrical collaborator, trust is the most important thing. If you don't, if the writer doesn't trust you as a dramaturg, then you're never going to be of use to them. So to Phaedra's point, like I always do whatever I can to try to build that bond. That's the most important thing that has to come first for me. And then it is very much deferential to the playwright is how do you like to work? What I try to say is, you know, I don't want to rewrite your play. I'm not interested in that because I would just write my own damn play and it would be bad. So what I'm here to do is to help you write the best version of the play you want to write. And so that can take a lot of forms. And then of course that depends on the writer. But yeah, that feels really important to me. I've become kind of obsessed with like how writers or other generative artists, I don't mean to just say playwrights, but not like why did you write this play necessarily, but what was going on in your life when you first decided you wanted to write this play? What were you listening to? What were you reading? You know, that's to your point. Like, what poetry are you reading? What music were you listening to? What books were you reading? And then if I ask, like, you know, also plays change and so do people. So I also try to like track how the play has changed thus far in a writer's mind. Cause like, you know, it's kind of useful to ask like, what made you start writing this play? Or what do you think this play is about? But I think it's actually more interesting to say, okay, and then do you still believe that? Do you still think that's what it's about? Because hopefully that can change or it can grow, I guess is a better way to put it. So and very much just trying to stay in conversation with the writer. And then practical things like, you know, when it comes, I find that, I don't know about y'all, but early on in a rehearsal process or sort of pre-rehearsal, it's just me and the playwright tends to be. Then when you get to rehearsal, you're part of a team. You're still mostly talking to the playwright. The closer we get to tech, the more I tend to start talking to the director. Because at that point, it's kind of their ship to sail. And so I'm trying to do that thing of like during run throughs going up to the director and saying, what do you want me to pay attention to for this run? What is freaking you out? What is bothering you? What's keeping you up at night? What do you want a second pair of eyes on? And sometimes they'll be like, Act 2, Scene 6 is driving me absolutely fucking insane. Can you watch? You know? And sometimes they'll just be like, I don't know, tell me if anything feels, is it funny? You know, like there can be that kind of stuff. And so I just wanted to also add that. I find it useful, especially during tech when, like, you know, I think the director is the most busy and the playwrights are often the least busy. It's like, okay, it's time to shift partners a little bit, I think.
Yes, I love what you said about kind of finding out what was sort of in the DNA of the play and the writer's life. I feel like that's so great, and definitely that trust is key. Trust is key. Jack also mentioned, you know, the writing of the play yourself, because they are obviously different roles, but I know we have some playwrights on this call as well. So I myself am not a playwright. I need that to be known. But yes, but for our other wonderful panelists who are playwrights as well, how would you say your work as a writer informs your work as a dramaturg?
Well, I learned how I like to be spoken to. And so then I can figure out how to speak to writers in that way. And I also learn because like I always have a dramaturg when I'm working on a play. And so then I also learned through what they do, what to do for me. So it's like a different way of learning, you know, and then translating that to the writers that I end up working with ultimately.
I can't say it better myself because it is that sort of double thing of knowing what it's like to be in a playwright's shoes when you're the dramaturg and knowing what it's like to be in the dramaturg's shoes when you're the playwright in the room. But I think, I don't know, I think it really has helped me. Weirdly enough, this isn't really about like new play development, more about just like literary management stuff. But I like getting so many rejections and stuff as a playwright. Like I feel like that has really helped me how to, you know, craft calls for submissions, craft rejection letters, craft like positive rejection letters, you know, like all the different things that playwrights may receive over the course of their career. Like that has actually been very helpful to me, and I think really, really useful in terms of just how to speak to writers, because I have been spoken to in ways that I really love and ways that I just am like, ouch, like, thank you for ruining my week. So I think that's something that I have found really useful of sort of being in this dual role in the theater.
I love that. I love that. I feel like also that's a great segue to kind of talk about feedback in general, which is such an important part of our job as dramaturgs, and one that I think, you know, for the people who are maybe not in the theater who are listening to this, and let's say their friend gives them, you know, their screenplay and says, "Can you give me some notes on this?" What's some advice that you would give for how to give feedback in a productive, kind of trust-based way that you've learned in your time as a dramaturg?
I have a sort of quick answer, so I'll volunteer to go first. Something that my sort of boss slash mentor, Charles at the Huntington, told me once is like that when it comes to reading people's plays or their art, like everyone is going to have a different note. Like every theater is going to have a different note. And like if, say, for example, like when I was working at the Huntington, if the Huntington wasn't ever going to produce this piece for whatever reasons, like there's only so much you should probably say to this writer about how to edit this piece, because something that might make it perfect for the Huntington would make it awful for the public, or like, you know, any other theater. So it's really about like knowing what your intentions are when you're giving feedback. Like, is it for development for your own theater? Is it just to help the writer? And then the other thing that I've been doing a lot, especially when I'm just reading work that, you know, I don't have any power to produce or anything like that, I like to ask people like where they are in the process, like what sort of feedback they want. Like, do they want thoughts about a particular moment or something? Because the last thing I want to do when I'm sort of doing this casual reading is to make someone stop working on that play or like give up on it, just because I said like, oh, I don't believe this character, and like maybe that's a character that like they grew up with and it just messes up their process. So that's sort of something that I have been doing lately, of being like, what sort of feedback are you interested in? You don't need to give me a lot, but just give me something. Let me know where you are in the process, and it'll help me adjust my expectations and also sort of adjust my notes.
That's really smart. And Charles was also my mentor friend, so we have like the same sort of pedigree in some ways. But I would love to add to that. In terms of notes, trying to frame it instead of like what I like and what I don't like, which I recommend never doing. It's like, well, what works, and like, what do you have questions about? So that it's an open door to conversation, and trying to understand, like what Sebastián was saying, the intentionality of what the writer wants, what they're specifically looking for, and then how you can specifically assist with that. I also want to bring up the cultural consulting, which is something that I do quite a bit, which is specifically working with kind of any sort of writer writing about Black people. And then they're most likely not a Black person, and they're asking for feedback and advice when it comes to that, which is something that I think is most likely going to be more and more prominent as we go forward. And I'm grateful, and I hope so. But I think when it comes to something like that, this is like a slightly different thing, but like what I always say to writers is, if you're writing outside of your experience and someone within that experience says no, your only answer is, okay, yeah, sure, yes. Otherwise, you're probably not responsible enough to handle that material. And I think that that's been something that is like a pretty hard rule for me. But I think it's really important to bring into the space, especially when we're working on scripts that we might not be in that experience with.
I completely agree with the, like, I always approach everything from the standpoint of like, is this useful, or what is useful? So yeah, asking where a writer is in their process, like what kind of feedback is helpful for them is always good. And for any of the playwrights watching this, like that's also just something to keep in mind is like, try to know that about yourself. Like, how do I like to receive feedback? That way you can enter a room with a dramaturg or artistic director, whatever, and you can help guide the conversation about, here's actually what's useful for me when I'm in process. That way we can go, got it, let's, you're leading the dance. You know, I also, the other thing I try to do, I don't do for everybody, because if people just don't want it, then I don't do it. But I always was reminded of the long since passed film critic Gene Siskel had this saying about when people asked him, like, how do you write a movie review? He said, I go to a movie, then I come home to my word processor, and then I describe what happened to me. And I love that framing of watching a story. So what I will do is I will offer to say, I will tell you, like, beat by beat what happened to me while I was reading your play. That way I'm approaching it kind of as like an early audience member, because that ultimately this is going to go in front of an audience. And the thing that's great about that is that I'm just one audience member. I'm not like the stand-in for every audience member who have different backgrounds and different senses of humor and all these things. So I can be like, I can tell you what happened to me. And then if you are talking to other people or getting to other people, you can ask what happened to them during certain things. I find that to be a pretty effective way of, that way, because that way you're not being like, well, here's what's wrong with your, you know, because that's awful and everybody hates that. That way there's a sense of humility about it. There's a sense of discovery for you, the dramaturg, about it. You're like, yeah, well, how did I feel during that scene? Like, what happened to me physically? Like, you know, did I, you know, was I excited or like, you know, in anticipation of something? Was I bored? Was I, you know, how was I feeling? And trying to describe that to the person who made it. Which I only add that to say, you know, to do so respectfully and in the spirit of collaboration. I've sometimes found that useful. I don't know if that's a thing, but I just started doing it because of Gene Siskel.
Yeah, experiential, the way to go.
Yes, just really quickly, like that just reminds me, I've been reading some like my friend, like close childhood friends, like plays and screenplays recently. And what I do for like people who I'm very close to, and this probably isn't useful, but it's sort of related to that. I sort of have like a Word document next to it, and I just live react to like every moment of it. And I'm just like, oh my God, like, or like I copy and paste a line. I'm like, this is crazy. I can't believe it. And you know, it's like so not this like buttoned up like institutional dramaturgy moment, but I think it's been helpful, or at least it's been helpful in like getting people excited about their script in a way that is like a good thing, you know? Like I find I like getting that feedback, so that's what I've been doing to other people. So that's sort of related to that.
I actually do that all the time with my independent consulting. So I do 2 pieces. So I send like this live reaction of literally the person's text that they give me. And then my next piece is like my whole, like, here's my dramaturgical analysis, like, you know, the really pretty stuff. But like they have both of these because I think they're both really important, because I think that emotional response is really, that's the important thing that playwrights need.
I'm so glad. I was literally like, I said that and I was like, these people are gonna think I'm crazy because I thought as a person, that's really great. And I think that is the way you just put it, Phaedra, is like smarter than I could have ever articulated it. That's really great. It is about, it's like what we do will be, hopefully you're not going to a play and sitting there going like, well, you know, you haven't gotten to the obligatory scene in Act 4. You know, like no one's doing that. Everyone's like, they're in it or they're not.
Totally. I always feel, I mean, if anyone wants to talk a little bit about Liz Lerman, if that's something that they use, I welcome the opportunity for someone to talk about that. But in the first part of Liz Lerman, where it's impressions, I always find that to be the most bountiful section for discussion and creating feedback, even more so than asking questions or giving the more traditional feedback.
The part about Liz Lerman that I like, and the part that we use in like I co-run this thing at the Public Theater called the Emerging Writers Group, which is a writer's residency for about 10 artists every 2 years. And we use sort of the Liz Lerman method. The most important thing for me from that technique is what we've already discussed, which is the artist leads the conversation, period. Not a moderator, not whoever has the strongest opinion in the room. The writer gets to decide, okay, you're done talking now. Or I don't want to talk about act 2. We're just going to talk about act 1 because that's where I'm at. I love that. That to me is the most important part of feedback. And I don't know that I ever heard it fully articulated that way until I read the little fun Liz Lerman critical response book. So that's what's valuable from that method for me.
Totally. There wasn't really a question specifically about Liz Lerman, but if anyone else has thoughts or wants to share with our audience about Liz Lerman or any other kind of texts that they use as a feedback method or dramaturgy text, you're welcome to share. If you use a mishmash, if you make it all up, if you do it all from your brilliant brains, that's great too.
I wish I had this book on my desk, but I just moved. And it is this book called Dramatic Theory. I don't know like the writer or the editor, but literally it's just like hundreds of essays of people talking about stories. Yeah, do you have it, Jack? Yeah, but what I really, really love about it is that it's just like a huge range of perspectives. And I find hearing how other people talk about story helps me understand story. So like, I absolutely love like Hero with 1,000 Faces. I love story theory, like Save the Cat, like anything that's about creating stories has been really helpful. And I think in terms of the actual, like the meat of it, of like when you're working on a play, because I have this foundational knowledge of like all these ways different people and different mediums tell stories, it's helpful. I also want to add, I think going to museums is studying stories, reading books, watching movies, watching television. Like I feel like you don't turn it off. You're constantly looking at story. And just so using your whole range of experiences really helps figure out ways that are effective and ways that you're curious about. Oh, I think that's, yeah, the Ducour. Dramatic Theory and Criticism, yes.
Everything I have to say about Liz Lerman has already been said. Like, I agree that the first part's the most generative part usually. But something that I wanted to add as someone who actually, during my dramaturgical career, has not done a lot of like new play development. It's mostly been like established plays. Is that I really find it useful to read interviews with playwrights like that have been published in books or like collected. Like I find interviews with playwrights are super useful to me just to understand how different playwrights think about writing, about their plays, etc. And just about art in general. Like that's always been very, very useful to me in the process.
And I'll just add that Sarah Rule's 100 essays I don't have time to write is something that I also keep on my like bedstand and helps me. I'll just like pick up one and read it, and usually helps me like reframe if I've been doing a lot of script reading and I'm getting into patterns that are like following the same kind of like, oh, I'm using the same bracket to score all these plays and I need to like freshen my brain. I think there's many things that we can use.
A good photo negative of the Sarah Rule essay book is Wally Shawn's essay book, which is maybe not surprisingly a much darker look at like story theory and stuff, because I don't know if you know Wally's plays, but they're not serious things.
Less whimsical, you might say.
Well, depends.
Whimsical.
If we're plugging books, the one book that I consistently find actually really useful, I think because it's not stuffy and it's not like there are only 7 basic plots, you guys, and that's it. It's like, okay. I mean, not that those books are wrong. I just find that like the style of them annoying. But and also this is a book written by a playwright. This is How Plays Work by David Edgar, who's a British playwright who wrote a lot of very weird plays like Pentecost. And I mean, you know, I just find it to be a really beautiful sort of distillation of like, here's what's cool about stories, is sort of the thesis of the book. And I appreciate the sort of the lack of grandiosity in the book. I find it much more important.
Well, I want us to switch gears a little bit from talking about like the fun artistic side to talking a little bit about the career side of things. And I would love to hear from everybody. I believe everybody on this call has had both experience working sort of like in institutional theater as well as in a freelance capacity. And I'd love to hear from everybody on how those experiences differ, how your role changes when you're working within an institution versus on your own. And also for anyone, who's out there who's interested in getting into this field, how you approach being a freelance dramaturg, either by like, how do you find playwrights to work with? How do you kind of set parameters when you're working as a freelancer with playwrights? That was many parts to that question. So, we can come back to we can piece it out if need be.
So I kind of like mostly left nonprofit theater about 3 years ago. I am still the resident dramaturg of New Harmony Project, where I help run that, organization. But I actually switched when I moved to New York City. I was working at like different theaters, but then a job prospect popped up at like a commercial institution, and I took it, and I've kind of been in the commercial world ever since. And I still do dramaturgy in the commercial world. Usually it's like labeled as something different, as producer or consultant or as developer. So, but like the role is still just down to the core dramaturgy, where it's working with the playwright from the beginning of a project to the end when it's produced or whatever it ends up being. And when it comes to freelance work, I think most of that has to do with the connection I've been able to make in doing new play development kind of across the country. I did start off in regional theater. And so like I was in regional theater for about like 5 years. And I think because of that foundation, I was able to meet a lot of writers. And then those writers recommend me to other writers who recommend me to other writers. And so the pool just kind of keeps growing. And also in my experience, I do work with a lot of the same people. And so it really all depends on like where they are in their process and like what the work is. But I find myself like being like a repeat dramaturg for some writers, which I find like really exciting to be at that point where it's like I can have my people, like my community. And so it's really, it's fun in that way. But it did take a long time to get there. I do not want to diminish the fact that I worked very hard. So.
Yes.
I was raised in captivity. So I was working at institutional theater when I started doing this. And it's institutional theater that keeps people there very busy. So I mostly have just been working for one institution for a lot of my career. However, like a lot of institutional dramaturgs in the last year, I've been on furlough for a couple of months from my job. And when that happened, I was like, oh, I should probably figure out how to do this freelance. So the last few months have been really interesting in trying to cobble together. There's so much you take for granted if you only have worked for one particular company, because you're looking for plays that fit the mission of that particular institution, and you have a working, in some cases, a deep working relationship with your collaborators. Freelancing is you're going into another institution and you're sort of the new kid on the block, and so that just has a slightly different energy to it. I've been having a lot of fun doing it, though. It's been a nice change of pace. I guess the thing to say is that if you are going into an institution from the outside as a dramaturg, I think it's important to kind of figure out, like, not to be weird, but like you figure out the politics of the institution. I think that is usually like a day or two of work is like, oh, okay, these two departments are fighting all the time, and it's weird, but that stuff does affect the rehearsal room, and it's important to know that. And I always encourage everybody who like comes, if they're like a guest dramaturg in the public, I kind of try to like let them know where the snake pits are, and as best I can. And so yeah, it's just a slightly different. And then of course there's like the stuff that anyone takes for granted when it's a salaried position, which is knowing how to advocate for yourself financially. Is a whole thing that I've had to kind of learn the ins and outs of, and I'm pretty bad at it. And so like that's a whole other thing that I'm still kind of working on. But like I've learned a lot of lessons in the last few months starting to do freelance.
Just to plug LMDA really quickly, they have some really great resources about advocating for consulting work specifically, including pay scales. So I highly recommend checking that out, especially if you're an early career dramaturg or any sort of dramaturg.
Yes.
I don't know where I am in my career exactly, but I do know that I used those exact resources when I started my furlough, and I was like, how much am I worth? And then they were like, this is how much you're worth. I'm like, oh, okay, great. They don't put it that way. I'm just being.
I feel like I have a similar pandemic experience to Jack, so I won't rehash. Like, I'm furloughed, and then I sort of was thrown into the freelance world. Because I, as well, like most of my work has been institutional. We're very busy at theaters, like doing marketing for the marketing department, like lots of stuff. So honestly, like if I'm being completely honest, I feel like over the pandemic, I'm really grateful to the Realm, who has kept me getting some money through their script share program, which has been really wonderful. Like that's mostly the dramaturgy work I've been doing over the pandemic. Because the other dramaturgy work, if I'm being honest, has been like focusing on my own writing. Like I've sort of been like, the pandemic is not a writer's retreat, and I've been really sad for a lot of it. But when I do have time and energy to work on my art, like I want to work on my art. So that's sort of been my experience over the pandemic. And the way that I think the Realm reached out to me to do the script share was through connections I made with other dramaturgs. So make sure that you're like friendly with other dramaturgs, because those people are the people who have been in your shoes and they understand what it's like. And most are very nice people who like are generous and kind. And like, I mean, look at the job we do, not to like pat ourselves on the back, but like, it can be a very thankless role. So yeah, that's what I would add to answer that.
And I'll just add, I think it's also obviously very institution dependent. You know, every theater is very different. Some have a very rigid idea or of what dramaturgy is and looks like at that institution, or they have a set amount of people that are the dramaturgs for that theater. One thing that I really love about working in the playwrights realm is that we are very playwright specific, playwright tailored. So while Alexis Williams, who's the associate artistic director, and Catherine Kovner and myself make up like our dramaturgy team at the playwrights realm, there are times where none of the three of us are the most well-suited person to dramaturg one of our shows or writers. And so we've had that happen this year. We were working on a play that was very Puerto Rico specific and also had a lot of Spanish in the play, and Alexis and I, neither of us are Spanish speakers, and we knew we would not be the most well-suited dramaturgs for that. We were able to bring in a brilliant guest dramaturg. And so I wonder, just thinking about that, how you've all managed in your career times when you feel like you are not, knowing when you are the person for the play, matching the dramaturg to the play, and how dramaturgs can sort of be advocates for good representation in our field, which I think is something that's hopefully shifting in positive directions.
Quick answer. Like, I think it's really about like knowing what your morals are. Like, I feel like theater can be a very immoral field just because the scarcity, like there is this culture of scarcity in the theater, unfortunately, where it's like, well, I was offered a job, like, oh no, should I take it? I think it might like make me a bad person. And it's like, no, you probably shouldn't take it. So like something that I've been doing is just like being like, no, like, yes, I need the money, but like someone else also needs the money who probably would do a better job at this. And like, I'm obviously lucky to say that, you know, like it means that I'm probably getting money elsewhere, etc. But yeah, that's sort of something I've been reckoning with, of just like knowing when just to say no. Like you don't have to agonize about it, you just have to say no. So that's something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I feel like asking the question of a writer, like, how can I be most useful to you, is not an idle question. And I'm also constantly asking that question of myself when I'm dramaturging. I mean, it's weird when I'm working at the public. It's a weird thing. I have positional power there because I work on the artistic staff, and like I'm going to be present in some way, shape, or form. during a process. Now, depending on whether I feel like that would be an asset to the room or not, I can scale back. And we're actually very lucky to have a number of dramaturgs on staff. So sometimes just knowing each other's, strengths and weaknesses, we can kind of confab a little bit and be like, my partner at the Public is a wonderful dramaturg named Jesse Cameron-Alec. And we've been working together for years and years and years. And instinctually, every time we announce a season, we're kind of like, okay, that one's yours for sure, based on a number of different factors. But I think what you said, Sebastián, is really important. It's if you're not actively helping a room, then get out. And that can be a very, humbling thing to think of. Like, no one wants to think they're wrong for a room, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person or a bad dramaturg. It just means like, yeah, this isn't the match. And that's okay. There will be other matches for you. So yeah. But I've also had a couple of times when, and it's hard because it's hard to know that sometimes. And I've definitely been in rooms where I was like, oh no, I feel like I'm being useful to this room, and I was not. And those experiences are forever etched on my heart. So, sometimes it's hard to tell.
This question is always so hard for me to answer because a lot of my practice really is freelance. And so when it comes to that, typically I'm sought out specifically to work on something that most specifically has to deal with like a Black experience. And so what I kind of do as my general policy is that I say, all right, well, what is the staff that's going to be in this? Like, my requirement is that at least 50% of people are people of color, and I don't count actors in that. Because I refuse to be the only one in the room anymore. And I have to say that is a new thing as of like probably like over a year ago. But it's something that I learned that like I was used as a stamp, quite frankly. And so, recognizing when that's happening and also recognizing my power is in saying no. And so I think that when it comes to work, I mean, it's like what Sebastián was saying. It's like it's your own moral compass. And like you're the one who has to like live with it. So
absolutely. Yes to all of that.
And like really quickly, just because the moral compass, like, I don't know, maybe this is too much, but like I'm always like, it's always interesting to like watch the theater world from afar and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like that person is doing this. And like the one advice I will give is like, just because someone who like you share identities with is doing something, like doesn't always give you a free pass to then like follow in that person's footsteps, like I feel like sometimes identity politics get boiled down to such a like exact thing that it's like, oh, if this person does it, that means I can do it because this. It's like, it really is just about like moral compass, and like you can be like, that's not okay, I'm not going to do that, even though I know other people are advancing their career doing the exact same thing. And that's a hard pill to swallow, but it boils down to you're living with it, like, can you live with it? And I personally don't want to live with that.
For sure. Well, I do want to say that our Q&A is open for anyone who's watching and wants to drop any questions in. I know we have one that I'll get started with, but feel free if you're watching this and you have a question for our wonderful panelists, drop it in the Q&A. So Jenna has asked if someone wants to get started as a dramaturg while doing something else full-time, such that internships and residencies aren't a feasible entry point, what would you recommend? Because my full-time role is outside the theater world and I'm not sure how to make those connections.
LMDA, I really can't say it enough. LMDA really helped kickstart my career personally, and they are an incredible resource of very generous dramaturgs and people who not only do they share work on like their Facebook page, but like there's a listserv where there's also work, and just like, and I would say like conversations with people, like reach out to people, have like Zoom meetings or coffee meetings when that's acceptable again, and then just talk. Because like people aren't going to know who you are unless you tell them who you are, and so much about it is self-advocacy and coming at it from a place of I am curious, as opposed from coming under, as in like I just don't know. Like, you are here, you're already making the steps, and so I think confidence is something that will really go a long way in terms of establishing relationships with other people.
I think something that you can do, and I know this sounds obvious, but like reading plays and like thinking about them like in a real way, like not just as a form of entertainment only, is something that like is helpful when you're first starting out, like thinking about like what is the playwright doing here, like how does this affect the story, like does this make sense, etc., etc. And that also applies for when you're watching plays, like when you're out watching a play at a theater, a local theater or whatever. The other thing I would say, and I know this is easier said than like sometimes found, but like any competition, any sort of fellowship, like sometimes they're looking for outside readers to like help read submissions. Like I think that's most of the time it's volunteer work, but I do think that's a good way to like maybe volunteer 5 hours of your week to read 1 or 2 plays and write a little report on it. Like that can be good stuff to have on your resume, but it's also unpaid, so it's not everyone can do it. But those are some things I would recommend to possibly look into.
I mean, and depending also, like, a lot of it is in kind of your circumstances, like where are you, what exactly is your full-time position, because theater happens in lots of different ways and lots of different times of day. So sometimes it's about finding the right community that frankly that fits within the schedule of your life as you want to live it, and can still be a creative outlet. And I think sometimes also expanding what you mean by theater, can sometimes be, because dramaturgy is supporting artists is something that is not just limited to like the regional theater circuit and off-Broadway theaters, right? There's many different fields and many different forms of advocacy. So also doing your research a little sideways is also maybe a smart way of finding opportunities that maybe wouldn't naturally occur to you. The only other small thing is like back to the scriptwriter thing is the crappy thing about scriptwriting is, yes, a lot of times it doesn't pay very much. But there are ones that do. Like I know that there are certain places that sort of focus on new play development or residencies that literally get thousands of submissions a year, and sometimes I know just through circles, like they will be in desperate need of scriptwriters, and so they have the people that they rely on, but then they'll start to sort of branch out. Like every 2 years, we open up the floodgates for emerging writers group applications, and every single time, I never have enough scriptwriters. So what I do is I go to the people that I work with before and trust and be like, who do you know and love? And please send them to me right now because I'm drowning in scripts. And so there are opportunities. So I guess that's just me co-signing to like try to get to know other dramaturgs, because a lot of my freelance stuff has been forwarded to me from other people who are like, hey, I can't do this, but I mentioned your name, and I'm like, oh, thanks, good looking out. So.
Definitely. And I'll just add also that I think it might actually be affiliated with LMDA, but there's like an early career dramaturg group on Facebook. And people often post like very, more freelancey, smaller opportunities there. And even if not those jobs, a great way to make connections and meet people in that sense. And yes, definitely feel free to reach out to the Playwrights Realm. We have a lot of scripts to read. So Stevie asked, can Phaedra talk more about puppet and ballet dramaturgy? I would also love to know more about this.
Yeah, so I'll start with ballet because these are like 2 separate things. And so with ballet dramaturgy, I think so much of it was me understanding how dancers tell a story versus how I understand story. And so thinking about it in terms of storytelling in a different, storytelling in a different way, obviously it's a different medium, but also thinking about how expression and how a body contorting can really alter the meaning of something. So the projects that I've been working on, they're actually news-based dance pieces where we're taking like things from the news and then we're making them into dance, and we're trying to figure out like, well, what can we do to make there's to have no language. And so in terms of like conveying something, kind of using the most basic form has been really exciting in terms of like deconstructing what I think about story, because like there are just some things when it comes to dance where it's like, words fail, but sometimes dance is able to convey things like emotional journeys in a way that is really difficult in text. And so I'm really learning how to appreciate it, but then also learning how to speak to dancers about their own craft. I find that a lot of them, at least in my experience, are like, yeah, I'm just doing this just to do this. But the choreographer that I've been working with is really dramaturgical. And so it's so much about collaboration, and it's so much about, well, this is the story that we want to tell. How would you tell it? And like kind of giving that ownership to dancers in a very, dance itself is like a very white patriarchal form. And so doing that, and this choreographer that I've been working with is a Black man. And so to do that with Black bodies has been kind of really incredible and meaningful. And we also work with an intimacy director. And it's kind of been for the first time, these dancers are recognizing that their bodies are their bodies and that they're allowed to say, no, don't touch me there, which is kind of incredible when it comes to like a physical form like that. So learning broad strokes, but then also kind of figuring out how to tell a cohesive story with no words. In terms of puppet, that's been extra fun, mainly because it's like it's like building character in addition to building story. And so thinking about what are the expressions that these puppets can have? What do their feet need to look like in order for us to know that this is a clumsy person or this is a very neat person? And so just using the visual medium in order to convey these like really big ideas. Because when it comes to puppetry, this is a TYA show. When it comes to puppetry, so much of it is like, well, you want the kids to use their imagination. The imagination is like, your most powerful thing. And so figuring out how to make suspense, how to make dread happen, but in a way that's like fun, because it's still puppets, but puppets can be like devastating and funny and beautiful at the same time. I think what's been the most exciting about working in like all these different mediums, in addition to, I do a lot of work in audio as well as theatrical plays, and very recently in television, where it's just like being flexible has been like my greatest gift as a dramaturg. And I highly recommend that. It's like understanding that when you come in as a learner, then you kind of unlock the potential to do a lot of other things with your storytelling.
Cool. All right, if anyone else has Q&A questions, drop them in. We're gonna do a few more questions. I would love to hear on the I don't want to get bogged down in talking about the pandemic. I think we've all talked about the pandemic enough. But I would love to know how your work has shifted in this time, and then kind of coming out of the pandemic, because I feel like we've been in this like incubation space, and so much important call for radical change in our industry happening right now. What are some changes you'd like to see implemented, either specifically as a dramaturg or just in the field in general, when we do get to be live and in person again?
I really want regional theaters to like invest in their community more instead of just trying to be like New York and Boston, which I think, I'm speaking just for Boston, but I know it happens elsewhere. And I think that's something that, invest in, because I feel like I'm a playwright as well. So here I am vouching for like local playwrights, but like, I feel like a lot of opportunities exist sometimes, not always, for like local directors or local dramaturgs to like really work on the theater that's happening in the city. But I think that playwrights are usually locked out in many ways, and not a lot of new work like happens. A lot of it is like work coming from New York that like did really great, and the New York Times loved it, so we're doing it. So that's something that I would personally like to see, just because I think it's also like there are good playwrights everywhere. I firmly believe that. And like, I think working on new plays is beneficial for everybody. It's beneficial for the dramaturg who's learning. It's beneficial for the director. It's beneficial for the actors. So I really think it is this thing that is like mutually beneficial, but isn't done enough for financial reasons or whatever. So that's something that I would love to see. I already see it not happening when I look at season announcements that are coming out. But maybe next year, maybe it'll change. That's something that I would like to see change.
The other thing that sucks about that is that it creates this culture of like, because it's so New York centric, that if you're an artist who lives anywhere else, there's like, well, if you want to be taken seriously as an actor, designer, ... you got to go to New York. I'm like, this city is not for everybody. And, you know, it's expensive and it's noisy and it's a lot of things. And, you know, to have communities that are sort of, you know, nothing is better than when like theaters from around the country and the world are like talking to each other and influencing each other. I don't want to say like everyone has to go to their Minneapolis does Minneapolis things and Philadelphia does Philly things. But yeah, investing in that community, because it also just puts this weird focus on New York that is not, I don't know, it just, yeah. And then also the other thing is like, just in terms of what back in the pandemic, and I'll speak as an institutional theater person, is, you know, literally about a year ago, a lot of institutional theaters made a lot of promises to change the way they work, to change the way that artists are treated, audiences are treated in their spaces. And because these physical spaces have been closed, they're really just, you know, there only so much work has been able to be done. My great fear is that a lot of us are going to reopen and just go back to the way we did things before and not actually live up to a lot of the big promises that were made. And I'm just really worried about that. And I really want that to not be the case.
I think for me is I'm interested in maintaining a healthy work-life balance. I think the pandemic has made it so it's like, you know what, I actually don't want to like be still at work at 11:30 at night. And so it's like, well, what are some ways to make it more equitable? And also thinking about access and being able to work with people. I mean, as much as Zoom theater is like, you know, whatever, I do really appreciate being able to work with people all across the country, especially when it comes to new play development. And I feel like it's so much more equitable to people who are parents, where it's like, cool, I can just like log on, do this thing, log off, and it's like they can still be working actors. And I do find those things good about what has happened. I think in terms of my hesitations for the future going ahead is the state of nonprofit theater, especially when it comes to the state of people of color within nonprofit theaters. Personally, for me, I'm just no longer going to invest in companies that are not doing the work. And like, that's just like, until they start doing it, then it's like, well, you don't get the privilege of my time. And, you know, I think it's really important for individual artists to kind of create whatever line in the sand that they want for themselves, because I don't genuinely believe any of these institutions are going to change until something like that happens, until they realize, oh, I can't do this show because, you know, the writer doesn't even want me to do it. And it's like, yeah, maybe you should change some things about like your policy. And so really I'm like letting it go on them. They're the ones who need to do the work, not me. So unless those changes happen, then it's like, I'll just work with the people who I want to spend time with, which has really helped me artistically, helps my soul. And I think also creates better work.
Hear, hear to all of that. I'm going to give us just our final Q&A question before we wrap up. And this is a fun one, is what's been one of your favorite collaborations with a director and what made it so good? And this is Candace asking as a young director who loves to work on new plays.
I have one director I really like working with because she is so awesome in including me. It's just as simple as that. Just CC me on the emails. You know, it's like when it's an actual collaboration between the three people involved, then it's like, okay, cool. Now we can actually make some good work happen. I think what is helpful is to have a meeting with everyone. And sometimes I work with directors who have never worked with a dramaturg before. And so some of my job is teaching them how to work with the dramaturg, which means like saying, hey, we're actually on the same team and I actually don't want your job. So when you're actually able to have that, then you're really able to make the good work happen. Because it's like, as a dramaturg, it's like you're there supporting the play and you're also there to support the process. And like, you know, whatever support that you need. But I think now students are learning about dramaturgs, but I think when I was going to college, I didn't even know what a dramaturg was. And so I think it's totally understandable that some people don't know how to work with dramaturgs. And so, yeah, a lot of it is just establishing what you do, what they do, and then making sure you can kind of open up the door to work together.
I think that's so true about just being included. Like, it's really that easy. And I think something that I always made an impact on me, which like is such a small thing, which is insane because it must happen in other industries like all the time, but probably not, is like talk to the like assistants, talk to the interns, talk to the like apprentices, like value their feedback, value, like ask questions to them about the play, like if they're in the room. Like some of my favorite directors to work with, like never take my notes. Like sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't take my notes. Like they're directing it, it's fine. But like they actually listen, and you can tell that they listen. Like they're listening to you give the note, they're gonna think about it, they're gonna decide that no, they're doing something different and that's okay, but it might unlock something. Like it's all about listening. Like listen to people, like actually listen. It's a skill, and I think a lot of people get so frenzied during tech or whatever that they just like are like, I'm a mean person now because I'm in tech. And it's like, you don't have to be that. Don't be that. Like we don't need that in this industry.
Kindness costs nothing.
It costs nothing, and it's a seed that grows in ways, beautiful ways that you don't expect. You know, and also this is a really tough business, and like if you can't move through it with kindness, it's even harder. Personally, like I immediately, two people I thought of when I saw that question were, I think the director I probably learned the most from when I was a very young dramaturg, and that is Lee Silverman, who directed one of my like absolute favorite plays we ever done in the public, which is a play called Wild Goose Dreams by Hansel Jung. And watching her work in a room on a very strange play that was very technically demanding was one of the most kind of like virtuosic things I think I've ever seen. I think a big part of it was that what I loved about her was that you knew the moment you walked into that rehearsal room that she would take a bullet for Hansel, and that no decision was made without like in any directorial way without knowing that it was like something that Hansel fully believed in, or at least was willing to try. And I kind of walked in the room and saw that and was like, oh, that's the way it always is. It's not. Not only that, but she really is very fun. I even during like the bowels of tech, it was like, she made it fun. I don't know how she did that, but I think it was just a reminder of like, we're here to work and we're professionals and we're taking this seriously, but this is also really fun what we get to do for a living, and never having that notion be too far outside the room. The other thing too, that other director that it made me think of is this, I love him so much. Stevie Webb is a director that I've been fortunate to work with a couple times, both at the public and outside. And the thing about Stevie that I love, if you don't know him, then you don't love him, but to know him is to love him. And he is so in tune with the role of theater as ritual. And that sounds like a weird thing to bring up, but the thing that I love about his very intentional articulation of the ritual of theater is that every single participant in a ritual matters. A ritual is constructed around who's in the room. And so you kind of feel like you're like going on a weird, joyful, like spiritual space adventure when you get into a room with Stevie. And it changes, and literally like working with him is like change people's lives. He's kind of a wonderful, I don't know, just gift to the planet Earth. But I think that there was something to that. And if I were to like try to distill what his secret sauce is, it's that he is so constantly aware of what every single person in a room is giving to the play, giving to the ritual, right? And he never is taking an eye off of anybody. And that just shows a level of care, I think, and commitment that is, and he's a pretty young director. Like, I don't care what generation of folk he's in the room with. Like, he commands immediate respect for that because he leads with such just respect and love. Anyway, I'm gonna stop pining for Stevie Walker-Webb.
I love it. I mean, I think that's a perfect note to end on, just the beautiful spiritual, ritualistic nature of theater, and a really great way to bring it back to, I think, what draws us all to this art form. I feel like that really made me so excited to be standing in a circle in a rehearsal room and making magic with people in a space again. So that was really beautiful. And I want to also just thank our wonderful, wonderful panelists for being with us tonight and sharing your words of wisdom. And I'd also say for any, writers who are looking for a dramaturg who happen to be watching, reach out to these fabulous dramaturgs. They're brilliant.
I'll sort of wrap us up. I'm going to post one more link in the chat, and that is our page for our upcoming community programs. We actually have another of this Making Theater With series featuring a panel of critics on June 28th, and a whole bunch more, both for artists, playwrights, and for general audiences. And I also missed in my intro that if you are a caretaker, a parent, or any form of caretaker, and you incurred some sort of cost, a caretaking cost, babysitter charge, anything like that to attend this panel, there will be information on a link so we can reimburse you for that through our Radical Parent Inclusion Project. And that's it. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks for everyone for attending. What a lovely conversation we just had. Thank you all so much, and everyone have a lovely night.
Bye, Internet.